investment. In this particular case, up to 45% of their investment if the whole thing was a disaster. And their upside would be limited to getting their investment back plus 10% in addition if it all went as well as it possibly could. So that was the sort of the range of exposure, minus 45% to plus 10%. The outcome funders, as I said, in this particular case were mostly governments. But of course, in another structure, they could be philanthropic or corporate foundations. Anybody who is used to writing the check and handing it over could, in this structure, do that, but know that there was a commercial driver to make the project work more efficiently. And then the thing that everybody worries about, the third-party evaluator and auditor. In our case, it was an accountancy firm. And they had, as I said, a very detailed matrix of points that they were checking on an ongoing basis. And they would provide regular reports to see how these rehabilitation centres were performing against those measures. And the measures were around training local people, using the IT that was going to be put into these rehabilitation centres more efficiently, in addition to sort of handing out and allowing people to learn to use their prosthetics, wheelchairs, etc. Now, this conventional structure can be, I think, easily adapted into a Sharia compliant structure. And for those of us who are active in the Islamic finance markets, there is a lot of discussion, endless discussion, about the social, the capacity for Islamic finance to invest in a socially useful way. For me, this transaction was in many ways the apotheosis of a socially useful project, and it has caused me huge distress to find that it didn't at that stage attract the investors that it should have done. The positive news that's come out of it is that this structure is now being looked at again by a number of Islamic institutions who do want to use this kind of structure to promote other very important humanitarian projects. So I'm very hopeful that going forward, having seen this particular transaction work in the market, that the Islamic markets will come to this again and be able to invest in and promote humanitarian work going forward. So, we believe that there are Islamic funds out there that need to invest in socially useful projects, but there are also pretty nascent pension and insurance funds that have been structured in a Sharia compliant way that are growing and will need to have Sharia compliant and ethical forms of investment going forward. So while this may be tiny at the moment, perhaps in 5-10 years and more, this will become a much bigger market. That seems to be the story for those of us in Islamic finance. We're always waiting for that point at which it's going to become massive. So a Sharia-compliant form of the HIB should be attractive to Muslim charities and to Muslim foundations and other organizations who are looking for ethical outlets for their investments. And of course, as is the case with commercial Sukuk and Sharia-compliant investments, something like a Sharia-compliant HIB doesn't have to be limited to just Muslim populations. It could be used for people in need anywhere in the world. It's not the faith of the beneficiaries that is at issue. It's the purpose of the investment that matters. And so this can be used for anybody. And it should not be the question that because it was the Red Cross that was issuing the humanitarian impact bond, somehow that makes it less attractive to Sharia-compliant funds, whereas if it had been the Red Crescent, that would have been more attractive. I think for those of us who are active in the Islamic finance markets, that's quite an abhorrent argument. And actually what is important is that if there are people in need and these projects help those people in need, then Sharia-compliant funds should be able to invest in those particular projects. The final slide that I'm going to talk to you about is the structure that I think would work for a humanitarian impact sukuk. This is a musharaka-based structure. And for those of you who are familiar with sukuk structures, I think you'll recognize how some of this works. So we would suggest that you would start with an SPV, which would issue sukuk certificates to the social investor. So that is the Munich Re's, the Lombard ODAs, and anybody else who wants to invest in this project. The SPV would contribute the cash that it raised by issuing those certificates into a musharaka, a joint venture arrangement with, in this case, the ICRC, which would provide the land on which the rehabilitation centres would be built. And so that would be the combination of the investment. Typically, the land would be worth about 30% or more of the overall investment, and the remaining 70% or so of cash would be raised by the SPV from social investors. That musharaka agreement would then have provisions set out in it, which would talk about who would run the musharaka. Typically, we would assume that it would be the ICRC, which would be acting as the agent of the musharaka joint venture parties in running the projects. And there would be an arrangement as to how the profits would be shared. Losses always have to be shared in accordance with the investment made by the parties. But if there was a significant amount of profit that was made here, and we were looking at the same commercial arrangement that the HIB had had, the parties could say that the first 10% of the profits would be paid to the SPV, which would pay those to the social investors, and any excess beyond that would be kept by the ICRC to use in other projects. So that would be entirely possible. And then in this diagram, you would have the outcome funders who would pay at whatever period it was decided. So it could be on an ongoing basis, or it could be at the end of the agreed period, and they would pay depending on performance, and the SPV would then take that cash and pay it to its sukuk holders, the social investors, as their return on their investment. And as I said earlier, the sukuk that the social investors had subscribed for could be treated like any conventional bond. So it could be listed on the London Stock Exchange, it would be clearable through the main clearing systems in Europe and the US, and typically anywhere else that you would want it to do, and it would be tradable. So it could work, and it could raise large amounts of money if there was the need for it. You could do this on a private basis. It doesn't have to have all of those bells and whistles if the amount that's being raised is relatively small. It could be sort of done privately, but it could also be scaled up hugely. And I think for those of you who are familiar with the work that the Global Alliance for Vaccinations and Immunizations has been doing, they use something similar to this, where they have a securitization program where their ongoing donations are paid to the people who subscribe for their bonds. But they've also issued Islamic versions of those sukuks, which have been successful. So the capital markets are somewhere that charities and organizations that need to raise a large amount of money for huge purposes, and wiping out certain kinds of diseases or illnesses is perhaps an example of the kind of work that could be done. The capital markets are there, and if we start having funds that want to invest in this kind of socially important work, then that there is that bringing together that a structure